Hello and welcome to part 3 of my adder CPD talk, my approach to searching for adders. In this part of the talk I'm going to describe how I personally go about looking for adders. For the removal of doubt, I reiterate here that this talk was not produced with any intention to influence good practice for reptile surveillance more generally. There's no agenda, it's for interest only. Notwithstanding, I'm sharing my approach because I want you to try and find fault. If you think I'm doing something wrong, then please tell me, because I want to get it right. To that end, I'm going to start with how I go about finding the right sites to search and describe a published scoring system that doesn't appear to be widely used, but that I've found to be really helpful. Then I'm going to talk briefly about how I approach searching for adders by stalking. This is an entirely academic request for advice because I've yet to find an adder basking away from an artificial refuge. So I'm raising it because you may be able to tell me what it is I'm doing wrong. Finally, I'm going to talk about how I approach searching for adders using artificial refuges. As with everything else, if you perceive any areas where I might make improvement, I would be very pleased to hear your advice. So, 3 subjects to cover, and first up, here's how I choose the sites to search. Looking for potential hibernation sites and their associated lying out areas has been simplified through the availability of Google Earth, and when I get to a site, I now know broadly what I'm looking for, such as the right aspect, absence of shade, and an overall impression of neglect. Notwithstanding, my confidence has been increased by the application of the Adder Habitat Suitability Index, defined by Brady, Phillips and Hodges of Kent Amphibian and Reptile Group. I was wholly unaware of this before I started my CPD project, but it's been out since 2014. Now I know about it, I apply it on every site. It's simple to use and I find it helpful. The HSI considers 9 attributes, comprising the surface area in hectares, orientation in relation to the sun, vegetation structure, topography, presence of basking sites, proportion of shade, disturbance risk, predation risk, and connectivity with favourable habitats outside. These are assigned a numerical score based on a qualitative scale. The individual scores are then totalled before being divided by 9. An outcome of 0.76 or above is considered good, and that gives quite a useful target when you're conducting management. So, I made my own version of the recording form, which is provided in my detailed CPD report. In it, I modified the wording in value 9, connectivity, so that I remember to give careful consideration to migration between the lying out area and the hunting grounds. I've been applying this for annual habitat monitoring, and it's led me to reverse some mistakes I've been making. Moving on. My reason for wanting to find a range of hibernation sites and lying out areas is that these offer situations where it's practical to map the natural basking sites where, if they are there at all, the adders should be conspicuous within specific periods. This would offer opportunities to test my field skills, and in particular, my stalking skills. This part of the talk is how I approach searching for adders by stalking alone, and if anything, it's a request for advice. I need you to review my approach and tell me if there's anything I'm missing, anything I'm doing wrong. Although I've been performing reptile surveys for over 2 decades, I've never seen an adder in a completely natural basking site. All the other species, except slowworm, yes, but adders, sadly, no. This may have been because the adders were not present on the sites I've searched, but I've attended to this and I'm now confident that they are present on several sites. On some of these sites I've put out artificial refuges. As these were initially placed in situations I considered optimum for basking, it's possible the snakes are now preferentially using the refuges, so I don't see them out in the open anywhere else. But I also know that they're present on other sites where I don't have refuges, but I'm still not finding them basking. I take heart from an account by Gibson and Dixon, who reported that it took an average of almost 10 hours in a range of 2.5 to 18 hours to find each adder in their study. Notwithstanding, my inability to find the snakes basking using fieldcraft alone bothers me, and I perceive my inability as a significant failing. I'm convinced that I'm targeting the right situations, so maybe I've been there at the wrong time, or something I'm doing has alerted the snakes to my presence and they've retreated into their dens before I saw them. So, considering the timing aspect, when is the right time to search? Well, according to the detailed accounts, many of which are the work of Bowens and Klaus, and which I've collated in my CPD report, this appears to be a broadly accurate representation of the situation. I'll go through it now in a narrative, and if you think it's wrong, I'd really like to hear from you. First, it appears that both males and females are most visible when they emerge from hibernation and bask communally at the hibernaculum. But, as I described in the previous talk, the males emerge first, bask communally in the best situations at the hibernaculum for about 2 weeks, before dispersing into the lying out area, before the females then emerge, bask communally, and then themselves disperse. So, to catch the males at the hibernaculum, I need to be there in February-March, and to catch the females at the hibernaculum, I need to be there in March and April. As I described in the previous talk, I've already collated the temperature ranges that trigger the emergence of the males and females in spring, so I'm now able to target the periods in which they should be appearing and aggregating at the hibernaculum. But, as they may be occupying different hibernacula within the wider hibernation site, just because I don't find the females where I found the males may not mean that I'm there on the wrong day. It may just mean that I need to widen my search. The second best chance of catching males and females basking in the open is in the lying out area in mid-April and up to mid-May, and I can use my summary tabulations as quick reference and time my searches accordingly. After that, as Bowens and Klaus point out, by mid-May the males decrease in visibility, having migrated to the hunting ground. While they're hunting, both species range widely, and in sunny conditions the literature suggests that they may only need to venture into the open for 5 to 15 minutes before they again retreat under cover. While in the hunting ground, the non-breeding females are said to be even more secretive than the males. Putting this together, mapping natural basking sites on a migration route or in a hunting ground would appear to be impractical, not least due to access constraints. And, even if a map were available, it's reasonable to assume that the probability of being at the right basking place in the right 15-minute period to encounter a snake will be low. So there's therefore little point in stalking for males and non-breeding females on a migration route or in a hunting ground. However, although non-breeding females are secretive, the pregnant females are apparently conspicuous in June and July, when they bask whenever the conditions are favourable. So, I might still attempt stalking for females in the lying out area. From mid-August, it appears that my searches should again target the hibernacula, where I might encounter individual snakes, until the temperature again drops to a daytime maximum of 8 degrees centigrade, after which there's little merit in continuing. In terms of the time of day, the little advice that I could pull together leads me to conclude that stalking is most likely to be profitable from 0800 hours to 1300 hours, when the air temperature is between 11 to 14 degrees centigrade. All this taken into account, I then looked at my stalking method and what I might be doing wrong that was alerting the snakes to my presence. Now, adders can detect the approach of other organisms through scent, sight, sound, and ground vibration. To what extent adders can smell my approach is unknown. No useful literature was found. However, I think it's wise not to apply any treatment to boots and be sparing in the use of bug deterrent spray prior to searches. In terms of sight, all snakes appear to have relatively low spatial resolution, which is expressed as cycles per degree. This is certainly true of adders, for which visual acuity is basic at high illuminance and adapted to identify contrast and movement rather than detail. I looked at the range estimates for vipers, and my conclusion was that an adder partially hidden in a small hollow or in dappled shade should be able to detect an object my size and shape approaching with the sun directly behind me at sufficient range to be aware of me long before I was aware of it. This is certainly the case with males in the mating season, and this fellow was obliging enough on his tin to show me repeatedly how far away he could see me when I positioned a drone over him and then approached over a low bank. If I approached from the southeast in the morning, moving toward him in a northwesterly direction, he detected my head and shoulders above the bank from 13 meters away on 2 occasions, and both times he retreated. Now, by this time he was aware of my presence, but when I approached from the southwest and moving in a northeasterly direction with the sun offset at an angle so I was not directly between it and the adder, I got to within 4 meters of him before he was aware of my presence. This hints that providing I don't get directly between the snake and the sun, I'll be less conspicuous to the snakes I'm stalking. Improving the odds of remaining undetected will therefore be a matter of keeping low, planning the approach to a likely basking place to take advantage of any shielding vegetation, and being sure that the sun is never directly behind me as I approach the basking place. It appears that rather than a direct approach, a flanking approach parallel to a south-facing slope or edge will be the best strategy. Now this may be obvious, but it took a little while to get it into my thick skull. Moving on, thinking about what I'm wearing from the viewpoint of the snake may also help. Advice on American forums suggests that camouflage trousers with a relatively light coloured top are preferable to an entirely dark outfit. Adders are dichromatic and perceive mainly the blue-green portion of the spectrum. A mid to light grey sweatshirt is a reasonable choice, therefore, and with a light-coloured baseball cap to finish the ensemble, I'm happy I've done what I can to mitigate my visibility. The third factor to consider is therefore that of sound. Although they do not have external ears, vipers do register low-frequency airborne sound waves, roughly below 600 Hz. Any thud is bad, such as the slamming of a car door and heavy footsteps. These certainly do elicit a response. Which leads us to ground vibration. While there is no useful gauge for ground vibration cues, the vague accounts given in published literature appear to be hypotheses rather than defined by controlled investigation. However, advice on American forums is to mitigate any potential for ground vibration through preparation of the pathway and by using heel-to-toe walking, also known as fox walking or soft stepping. The technique is as follows. Keeping the knees bent, gently place the heel of the leading foot on the ground. Then slowly roll the foot forward on the outer edge before lowering the sole. Then transfer body weight onto the leading foot and wait 2 seconds, keeping the head still and searching with the eyes. And repeat. The idea is to move forward with shoulders hunched and the head maintaining the same plane, so not bobbing up and down. Pausing frequently is recommended because movement draws attention more than shape. Mature conifer plantations are great places to practice this. If you can move over that substrate without making a sound, then you can be confident you're getting the hang of it. Aside of that, if you don't feel like you're doing a duck impression, then you really aren't committing to it. Putting all the advice together, I was able to get close enough to see and photograph this subadult female on her onduline, this adult female on her tin, and this adult male on his tin. I've put all the advice together in my CPD report, so if you haven't downloaded it already, this is a good place to pause so you can, and take a comfort break before we move on to how I approach the searching adders using artificial refuges. I am going to have a mouthful of water. Okay, so moving on, we come to my approach to searching for adders using artificial refuges. For those unfamiliar with the subject, adders exploit sun-exposed features that warm rapidly as basking sites, where they gain heat directly from solar radiation and by absorbing heat through contact with warm substrates, beneath or alongside sheltering features. Gaining heat directly from the sun by basking in the open is known as heliothermy. Gaining heat by resting against a warm substrate, such as under an artificial refuge, is known as thigmothermy. Surveyors enhance a site by deploying artificial refuges that warm rapidly under suitable weather conditions, creating thermally favourable situations that adders readily exploit for basking or for shelter. The refuges therefore provide predictable locations that can be visited repeatedly during survey campaigns. If the snake is on top, it can benefit from a combination of heliothermy and thigmothermy. If it's underneath, it benefits from thigmothermy whilst mitigating predation risk. And, as the snakes are often underneath, the surveyor benefits from the snake being unable to smell them, hear them, or see them. The surveyor therefore has a clear advantage. Now, historically, a wide variety of materials were deployed for surveillance, such as plywood, wooden boards, corrugated asbestos, carpet tiles, roof tiles, concrete slabs, rubber car mats and black plastic sheeting. For reasons of convenience as much as anything else, the refuge materials I commonly use comprise corrugated steel, typically referred to as tins, corrugated roofing felt, typically referred to as ondulines, and shed felt. I like to deploy them in sets of 3. Over years of surveillance, I'd perceived adders as having a preference for tins and ondulines over shed felts. This figure is a simplification of data presented in my CPD report, and I accept that I don't have a massive amount of records. The first point to make is that my limited data demonstrate that shed felt does have a value to adders. They do exploit it for thermoregulation. Furthermore, common lizards and slow worms both exploit shed felt and adders eat them, so shed felt will inform whether there's a resource of prey on a site too. The second point is that my refuges are not all the same size. The tins are 0.6 metres squares. The ondulines are now 0.5 metre squares, and the shed felts are 50 centimetres by 30 centimetre rectangles. This is because I've found that at larger sites, the ondulines and shed felts become larger. When the ondulines and the shed felts are larger sizes, they become floppy on sunny days and they're difficult to lift evenly. They're therefore peeled up rather than being lifted, with the result that a reptile in a corner may escape before I can register it. This is particularly the case where there are multiple animals or multiple species under the same refuge. Another issue is that the larger sizes, shed felts tear when they're hot and also bed down and tear on projections beneath. The result is that when you lift them, you very soon end up with 2 refuges rather than 1. Now, I do accept that if all the refuges were the same size, the adder records might be more evenly distributed between them. However, the third point, one that should not be overlooked, is that 88% of encounters were under a corrugated profile, and I'm convinced that that profile is important. Moving on, when I looked at other published accounts, I found that Hodges and Seabrook also perceived adders as favouring tins over shed felt. But Hodges and Seabrook wanted their tins to be more versatile, and they came up with a really neat enhancement. What they did was effectively to construct insulated mattresses for the snakes. They did this using bubble foil insulation, which they cut to be half the surface area of their tins but double the thickness. They then sprayed the surface brown and fixed a squashed section of pipe to the mattresses to ensure there'd be a gap between the tin that was to go on top and the mattress beneath. The figure here shows the brown painted bubble foil and the squashed plastic pipe with a male in residence. The corrugated tin would have been on top, but has been lifted so that you can see the snake and the mattress. Their results are impressive. Significantly more adders were recorded under enhanced tins where they had the option of the insulation mattresses. And if these results were not already compelling, in the enhanced situations, double the number of snakes were recorded on mattresses than off them. Rolls of YBS general purpose thermowrap insulation are available from Toolstation. And masking tape, brown paper and plastic pipe are all available in hardware stores. Once made, the insulation mats are easy to carry and deploy, and they should be very long lasting. The increased probability of not doing a boring survey should make them as attractive to ecologists as they are to adders. Now, it is noted that the insulation mats are not biodegradable, but they will be very long lasting. So on the subject of biodegradability, I've begun to be troubled by the amount of waste my surveys have been producing, and I'm even more troubled by the amount of shed felt rubbish that some people still leave on sites post-survey. An often overlooked part of our work is the volume of non-biodegradable and non-recyclable waste material it generates. Many people are unaware of what shed felt actually is. Although the older material was organic cellulose and bitumen, it isn't anymore. The modern material is either polyester net in the expensive stuff for domestic flat roofs and commercial buildings, but in most cases the stuff we're buying is glass fibre, and that's what we're using for reptile mats, our shed felts. Onduline and shed felt may only last for a couple of years before they lose integrity, and if they aren't collected and disposed of responsibly, those fibres and oil-based muck are left to damage the environment. Miles of temporary exclusion fence are dumped annually, and even permanent fence is not permanent. It gets damaged and sections are dumped, and ultimately the whole thing is taken out and it ends up in landfill. And I'm not happy with that. So I wrote my partner Teresa into an investigation of whether painting the upper surface of some of our corrugated tins matte black, and also using 9mm plywood boards, both unpainted with the upper surface painted matte black, might provide sufficient variety for us to stop using onduline and shed felt, and at least we'd mitigate some of the pollution we were creating. We did this using a bespoke bed that we made to be level and open to the sun on a south-facing edge. On this, we deployed a grid of 6 refuge types, with data loggers deployed on top and underneath. On the left, we have a pair of unpainted and painted tins. In the middle, we have a pair of unpainted and painted plywood. Then on the right, we have a shed felt, and finally an onduline. To ensure balance, all these refuges are the same size. Now, unsurprisingly, painting steel and plywood matte black does result in the material heating up faster and being hotter overall in conditions of full sun. Although the effect was less pronounced for the tins in conditions of sunshine and showers, the difference remained marked between the painted and unpainted plywood. We actually looked at this in terms of the reported selected body temperature for all reptile species, all our native reptile species. But focusing on the adder, we found that in full sun, the unpainted plywood delivered the adder's selected body temperature for the greatest proportion of the day, with painted plywood second and onduline third. However, in sunshine and showers, the bitumen-derived onduline refuges delivered the selected body temperature for the greatest proportion of the day, with unpainted corrugated tin a close second and painted corrugated tin third. So we then looked at the results from the perspective of which material adders would avoid for the greater proportion of the day by virtue of the refuge being too hot. We found that in conditions of full sun, the unpainted plywood and unpainted tin refuges consistently remained below the critical maximum temperature. In sunshine and showers, the ranking was pretty much the same. Although the painted tin and plywood change places, the unpainted ply and tin are still the best, and shed felt is consistently the worst. We therefore concluded that combinations of painted and unpainted plywood and steel would be a sensible alternative to bitumen-derived refuges. The full report is on my website if you want to see the rationale or check our working out is correct, but I'm now phasing out my shed felt and onduline refuges. The only issue I have is that I'm convinced that a corrugated profile contributes to the overall appeal of these refuges, but although there is a version of corrugated plywood available in the US, it's only 2.4mm thick, so how it would compare with the 9mm I've been using is unknown, and in any case, it does not appear to be available in the UK. Now, having chosen our refuge materials, I am now deploying refuges in natural basking sites I am not now deploying refuges in natural basking sites because I want to leave them for testing my stalking skills. Instead, having looked at coastal sites where adders occur away from heather, I found that in the situations they were exploiting were structurally identical to the mature heather cover. It was low woody vegetation that allowed the sun to penetrate to ground level. So, rather than putting my tins in the natural basking sites, I'm making artificial basking sites in edge situations so that I can augment the habitat with artificial refuges. Where it's available, I'm making use of brash, etc. to create south-facing edges. And sometimes I'm rough pruning weed trees like these western hemlock saplings so that rather than eradicating them, I'm using them to make low scrubby situations that I can manage. When I've been able to get on a site in the winter and where I'm confident I'm not on a hibernaculum, rather than eradicating large areas of thorny cover from my lying out areas, a mistake I'd made early on, I have instead been lowering the height of the scrub and hollowing it out. So these are hollowed out shady blackthorn, which I've hollowed out to create south-facing horseshoes with the intention of delivering sheltered basking sites for breeding females in lying out areas. And that means I can deploy my refuges in here, so I'm still doing monitoring, or I'm doing surveillance to inform monitoring, or company monitoring, but I've left the natural basking sites without refuges in, so I can still practice my stalking. But enough of this. Before I wrap the talk up, I'd like to share my approach to the timing of searches for adders using artificial refuges. In the previous talk, I described emergence from hibernation, where adders are at different times of year, and when they return to hibernate at the end of it all. I'm broadly happy that what I have in seasonal terms is accurate, so the month, season the refuges should be checked will depend on the function of habitat, i.e. hibernation site, lying out area or hunting ground. But I wanted to leave you with something to consider. Accepting that I've relatively few adder records, I personally do 4 circuits each day when I'm monitoring. These comprise an hour following sunrise, 2 hours following sunrise, within either side of an hour of solar noon, and 3 hours or more following solar noon. As I don't have many records, I've grouped my records into just 3 time zones, comprising morning from sunrise to an hour before solar noon, midday an hour before to an hour after solar noon, and afternoon after the 2-hour midday period. So, despite doing 2 visits in the morning, my adder records are pretty well matched in the morning and afternoon. but so far I've encountered adders less during the 2-hour middle of the day circuits. To ensure I was doing my circuits in the right condition, I focused on air temperature in my data to see if I could define a believable Goldilocks zone where adders would exploit the temperature of the refuges through thigmothermy. To that end, the temperature values for my adder records were grouped for me by my partner, Teresa, into a reasonable likelihood range, which was defined as mean, plus or minus 1 standard deviation, and a voluntary tolerance range, which was defined as mean, plus or minus 2 standard deviation. And this is my Goldilocks zone for refuges, 13 to 23 degrees centigrade. Now, the first point to make is that when I suggest a Goldilocks reasonable likelihood range of 13 to 23 degrees for the adder, I mean that in my data adders appear to be recorded in association with refuges most often when the temperature recorded at about waist to chest height on my reed thermohygrometer in an open situation is between 13 to 23 degrees. However, adders may also be found under a refuge when the temperature is in the wider voluntary tolerance range of 8 degrees to 28 degrees centigrade. So they might be under or on top of the refuges at that time. I don't have enough data to really be able to separate it under or over. Would be interesting. As time goes on, I hopefully will build enough. Anyway, the season the refuges should be checked will depend on the function of the habitat, hibernation site, lying out area or hunting ground. Regardless, adder surveillance using refuges would appear to be most profitably performed when the air temperature is between 13 to 23 degrees. Taking into account the temperature ranges for stalking, my approach is therefore now that in what I consider the heliothermic period, when the sun is shining but the temperature is 13 degrees centigrade or below, as the adders are most likely to be encountered basking in the open or on top of the refuges, I stalk, but I do not approach the refuges or physically disturb them. But when the temperature I consider to be the thigmothermic period from 14 degrees upwards and the refuges are themselves warm enough for the adders to get the heat they want by sheltering underneath and avoid the risk of avian predation, I start looking under the refuges as well. So I'll repeat that. When the temperature is below the 13 degrees, I will stalk. I'll approach the refuges, but I don't flip them. When the temperature rises above the 13 degrees and enters the thigmothermic period from 14 degrees upwards and the adders can be below the refuge, still get enough temperature and avoid the risk of avian predation, I look under the refuges as well. And if you think that's wrong, this is the end of my talk and there's no better time to message me through my website and tell me so. You'll find on the website the scripts for all 3 talks. So if I've been a bit vague or I've fumbled or bumbled over some of the passages or mumbled anywhere, you can get the script and follow the talk yourself, reading it and pausing it at each slide. So I'm very serious. If you think I'm getting anything wrong, then I really want to hear from you. That's what CPD is all about. It's about improving it, developing and getting it right. So please do make a comment on this talk, come through the website, tell me. And thank you for listening.